Chicago, 1894. Winter had descended upon the city with unforgiving brutality, the kind that made even the sturdest of buildings creak in protest. The Great Fire had long since transformed the city's landscape, but the shadow of that devastation lingered in collective memory as surely as the soot that still marked some of the oldest surviving structures. Margaret Blackwell pulled her wool coat tighter around her slender frame as she hurried down Michigan Avenue, her heeled boots clicking against the icy cobblestones. At 32, she carried herself with the quiet dignity of a widow who had fought to maintain her position in society after her husband Thomas's unexpected passing 3 years prior. The photography studio she had inherited from him had become both her salvation and her prison. The bell above the door jingled as Margaret entered Blackwell Photography, the familiar smell of developing chemicals and polished wood greeting her. Her assistant, Clara, a young woman of 20 with quick hands and quicker wit, was already arranging the equipment for their first appointment. "Mrs. Blackwell, you're just in time," Clara said, smoothing down her apron. "The alderman's family will be here within the hour." Margaret nodded, removing her gloves finger by finger. "Is everything prepared for the sitting?" The alderman has been quite specific about his requirements." "Yes, ma'am. I've set up the formal backdrop with the column as requested. And the new camera has arrived from New York." The new camera, a Rochester optical company. Masterpiece sat imposingly on its tripod, gleaming with promise and possibility. It had cost Margaret nearly a month's earnings, but in the competitive world of Chicago's elite portraiture, staying ahead of technological advances was essential. "Excellent," Margaret said, examining the camera with professional scrutiny. "Let's test it before they arrive." As Margaret peered through the viewfinder, adjusting the focus with practiced precision, she couldn't shake the unsettling feeling that had plagued her since waking. A strange dream had disturbed her sleep, something about a child with eyes that seemed to look beyond her, beyond the room itself. She dismissed the thought. Dreams were meaningless fancies, and she had no time for such nonsense with the important appointment ahead. The alderman's family arrived precisely on schedule. Alderman James Woodridge was a portly man with an imposing mustache and political ambitions that extended well beyond Chicago's city limits. His wife, Constance, was a delicate beauty whose gentle demeanor belied her steel-like determination to see her husband advance. Their 2 children, Elizabeth, age 10, and William, age 7, stood dutifully beside their parents, dressed in their Sunday best, despite it being a Tuesday. "Mrs. Blackwell," the alderman greeted, his voice booming in the modest studio. "Your reputation precedes you. They say you capture not just appearances, but character." Margaret offered a practiced smile. "You're too kind, Alderman. I merely attempt to preserve what already exists." She gestured toward the carefully arranged sitting area. "If you would all take your positions, we can begin." The family arranged themselves with practiced formality. The alderman seated in the center chair, his wife standing just behind his right shoulder, her hand placed lightly upon it, and the children positioned on either side of their father. Margaret disappeared beneath the black cloth, making final adjustments to her new camera. "Now, please remain perfectly still. This exposure will take approximately 30 seconds. Through the viewfinder, Margaret studied the family's composition. The alderman, stern and commanding; Mrs. Woodridge, poised and elegant; Elizabeth, the perfect image of a well-bred young lady. And then there was William. The boy stood unnaturally still, his posture rigid, his gaze fixed not at the camera but slightly to the left of it. Margaret was about to request he look directly into the lens when something in his expression stopped her. His eyes. There was something peculiar about them, a depth that seemed inappropriate for a child so young. She pressed the shutter release anyway. 3 days later, Margaret worked alone in the darkroom, developing the Woodridge family portraits. Clara had gone home for the evening, leaving Margaret to the soothing routine of chemical baths and careful timing. She had always found peace in this process, watching images emerge from blankness like ghosts taking form. The alderman's photographs were developing nicely. The composition was flawless, the lighting exceptional, a testament to her skill and the quality of her new camera. She hung the prints to dry, satisfied with her work, until she came to the final image. It was the formal portrait of the entire family, and at first glance everything appeared perfect. The alderman looked appropriately dignified, his wife appropriately devoted. Elizabeth stood with perfect posture, a small smile gracing her features. But something was wrong with William's eyes. Margaret squinted, bringing the photograph closer to the red safety lamp. The boy's face was clear enough, but his eyes, they appeared to be reflecting something, or someone. In the reflective surface of the child's eyes, there appeared to be a figure, a silhouette that could not possibly have been in the room during the sitting. "Impossible," Margaret whispered to the empty dark room. She knew every inch of her studio, every shadow and light source. There had been no one standing where William's gaze was directed, no one that could have created such a reflection. Margaret carefully placed the photograph on the drying line, trying to dismiss the unsettling image as a trick of the chemicals or a flaw in the new camera. Yet she couldn't shake the feeling that she had captured something that shouldn't have been there. Later that evening, in her modest apartment above the studio, Margaret found herself unable to sleep. The image of William's eyes haunted her thoughts. As a photographer, she prided herself on her technical precision. There was always a logical explanation for anomalies in photographs. Light leaks, double exposures, improperly mixed chemicals all could create strange effects that the superstitious might interpret as supernatural. Yet none of these explanations seemed to account for what she had seen in William's eyes. By morning, Margaret had convinced herself that fatigue had caused her to imagine the anomaly. She dressed quickly and headed downstairs to the studio, determined to examine the photograph in proper light. Clara was already there, arranging the day's appointments in the leather-bound ledger. "Good morning, Mrs. Blackwell. The Woodridge portraits, are they ready?" The alderman's wife sent a messenger this morning inquiring after them. "They're drying," Margaret replied, moving toward the dark room. "I'll prepare them for collection today." In the harsh light of day, the portrait appeared even more disturbing. The reflection in William's eyes was unmistakable. A tall, thin figure standing where no one had stood. The silhouette was indistinct but undeniably human in shape. Margaret felt a chill run down her spine despite the warmth of the room. "Clara!" she called, her voice steady despite her unease. "Did you notice anyone else in the studio during the Woodridge sitting? Perhaps someone who came in while I was focusing the camera?" Clara looked up from her ledger, brow furrowed in thought. "No, ma'am, just the family and ourselves. Is something wrong with the portraits?" "No," Margaret lied, carefully placing the photograph in a protective sleeve. "I'm merely being thorough." She would have to retouch the boy's eyes before delivering the portraits. Such an imperfection would be unacceptable to a client of the alderman's standing. Yet as she prepared her retouching tools, Margaret couldn't help but wonder what or who had been reflected in William Woodridge's gaze. The Woodridge family returned to collect their portraits the following afternoon. Margaret had spent hours meticulously retouching the image, carefully altering William's eyes to remove the strange reflection. The result was technically perfect, though the boy's gaze now had a slightly vacant quality that she found almost as disturbing as the original anomaly. "Mrs. Blackwell, these are exquisite," Constance Woodridge exclaimed, examining the portraits with evident pleasure. "You've captured James's dignity perfectly." The alderman nodded in agreement, though his attention seemed more focused on how the images would enhance his public persona than on their artistic merit. Elizabeth stood dutifully beside her mother, occasionally glancing at her own image with shy pride. William, however, stood apart from his family, his gaze fixed on the original, unretouched portrait that Margaret had inadvertently left on her desk. "Mrs. Blackwell," the boy said suddenly, his voice soft but clear, "why did you change my eyes?" The room fell silent. Margaret felt her heart skip a beat as all eyes turned toward her. "I beg your pardon," she managed, forcing a smile. William pointed to the original photograph. "In this one you can see him. In the others he's gone." "William, don't be rude," his mother admonished, casting an apologetic glance toward Margaret. "I'm sorry, Mrs. Blackwell. He has such an imagination." Margaret maintained her professional composure. "It's quite all right. Children often see things differently than adults do." She carefully took the unretouched photograph from her desk and placed it in a drawer. Some minor retouching is standard practice in portraiture. It ensures the final image meets our high standards. The alderman seemed satisfied with this explanation, but William continued to stare at Margaret with unsettling intensity. "He's still there, you know," the boy whispered as his family prepared to leave. "Even if you can't see him in the picture anymore." Before Margaret could respond, Constance ushered her son out the door, offering profuse thanks for the beautiful portraits and promises to recommend Blackwell photography to her social circle. As the bell above the door signaled their departure, Clara approached Margaret's desk. "What was that about, ma'am?" The boy seemed quite upset about something. Margaret hesitated, uncertain how much to share. Clara was practical and level-headed, not one for ghost stories or superstition. It was nothing. Children often become fixated on strange details. But later, alone in her dark room, Margaret retrieved the original photograph from her desk drawer. Under the red safety lamp, Williams's eyes once again revealed the mysterious figure, a tall, thin silhouette that seemed to be looking not at the boy but directly at the camera, directly at her. For the first time in her career as a photographer, Margaret Blackwell found herself afraid of an image she had created. That night, Margaret wrote to Professor Richard Bennett at the University of Chicago. Bennett was a respected scientist who had published several papers on the new field of paranormal research. attempting to apply scientific methodology to supposedly supernatural phenomena. While Margaret considered herself a rational woman, she needed someone with scientific credentials to either confirm her fears or preferably dispel them with a logical explanation. She included the unretouched photograph with her letter, requesting his confidential opinion on the anomaly. After posting the letter, Margaret returned to her apartment above the studio, locking the door with unusual care and checking twice that all windows were secured. Despite her precautions, sleep eluded her. Each creak of the old building, each shadow cast by passing carriages on the street below seemed suddenly sinister. She found herself staring at the dark corners of her bedroom, half expecting to see a tall, thin figure emerging from the shadows. Dawn found Margaret exhausted but resolved. Whatever explanation existed for the strange reflection in William Woodridge's eyes, she would discover it. Her reputation, and perhaps her sanity, depended on it. Professor Bennett's response arrived with surprising promptness. His letter, written in a precise academic hand, requested a meeting at his university office that same afternoon. Margaret canceled her appointments and made her way to the University of Chicago, the unretouched photograph secured in her handbag. The university campus stood in stark contrast to the industrial grime of much of Chicago, its Gothic architecture and manicured grounds creating an atmosphere of scholarly removal from the city's commercial chaos. Professor Bennett's office, located in the psychology department, was cluttered with books, scientific instruments, and what appeared to be photographic equipment of various types. And the professor himself was younger than Margaret had expected, perhaps 40, with a neatly trimmed beard and wire-rimmed spectacles that magnified his keen eyes. He rose to greet her with formal courtesy. "Mrs. Blackwell, thank you for coming. Your photograph has presented me with quite the puzzle." He gestured toward a chair opposite his desk. "Please, sit. Would you care for tea?" Margaret declined the tea but took the offered seat, watching as Bennett carefully removed the photograph from an envelope. "I've examined this under various lighting conditions and with several magnifying devices," he said, placing the photograph on his desk. "The reflection in the boy's eyes is genuinely perplexing. It doesn't appear to be a chemical anomaly or a fault in your equipment." Margaret felt a chill despite the warmth of the office. "Well, what do you believe it to be, Professor?" Bennett leaned back in his chair, steepling his fingers beneath his chin. "I have several theories, none of them entirely satisfactory. The most mundane explanation would be that someone was indeed standing where the reflection indicates. Perhaps a studio assistant that neither you nor the family consciously registered." "Impossible," Margaret stated firmly. "I know every inch of my studio. There was no one standing there." "Then we must consider alternative explanations." Bennett's tone remained measured, scientific. "Have you heard of spirit photography, Mrs. Blackwell?" Margaret's expression hardened. "I have, and I consider it fraudulent nonsense practiced by charlatans who prey on the bereaved." Bennett nodded. "I share your skepticism regarding most such claims. However, there exist documented cases where inexplicable images have appeared in photographs taken under controlled conditions. Images that defy conventional explanation." He reached for a folder on his desk and extracted several photographs, laying them beside the Woodridge portrait. These were taken by reputable photographers, none of whom had any history of fraud or trickery. All contained similar anomalies, figures or faces appearing where none should be. Margaret examined the photographs, her professional eye noting the similarities to her own troubling image. "What are you suggesting, Professor? That I've captured a ... ghost?" Bennett's expression remained serious. "I'm suggesting that your photograph may have captured something that exists beyond our normal perception. Whether we call it a ghost, a spirit, or simply an unexplained phenomenon is a matter of terminology rather than substance." "This is absurd," Margaret stated, rising from her chair. "I came to you for a scientific explanation, not supernatural speculation. Science begins with observation, Mrs. Blackwell. When we observe something that defies our current understanding, we must either expand our understanding or deny the evidence of our senses." Bennett adjusted his spectacles. "I believe you came to me because, on some level, you recognize that what you've captured exists outside conventional explanation." Margaret sank back into her chair, suddenly weary. "What would you have me do, Professor? I cannot present this to my clients. I've already delivered retouched versions of the portrait. I would like to visit your studio if I may. Perhaps there's something about the physical space that might explain this phenomenon, and ... He hesitated. "I would like to speak with the boy, William Woodridge." "The alderman would never permit it," Margaret said. "He's a practical man with political ambitions. He would not welcome involvement in anything that might be deemed ... unusual." Bennett nodded thoughtfully. "Then we shall begin with your studio. Perhaps the answers lie there." As they prepared to leave, Bennett carefully returned the photograph to its envelope. "One question, Mrs. Blackwell. Have you experienced anything unusual in your studio since taking this photograph? Cold spots, unexplained noises, objects moving without apparent cause?" Margaret hesitated. She had not mentioned the strange occurrences of the past few days, the unexplained footsteps she'd heard after Clara had gone home, the equipment that seemed to have been rearranged overnight despite the doors being locked, the persistent feeling of being watched. Nothing significant, she lied, unwilling to feed what she still considered to be superstitious nonsense. But as they left the university and made their way toward her studio on Michigan Avenue, Margaret couldn't shake the feeling that something or someone was waiting for them there. Professor Bennett insisted on examining every inch of the studio, paying particular attention to the spot where William had stood during the portrait session. He measured distances, tested light angles, and made copious notes in a small leather-bound journal. Margaret watched with a mixture of skepticism and growing unease. The professor's methodical approach lent an air of scientific legitimacy to what she still wanted to dismiss as imagination or technical error. "Mrs. Blackwell," Bennett said suddenly, looking up from his notes, "is there a history to this building that you're aware of? Previous occupants, perhaps events of significance?" Margaret considered the question. "The building dates to before the fire, one of the few in this area to survive. It was originally a watchmaker's shop, I believe. After the fire, it was converted to various uses, a milliner's, briefly a doctor's office, then vacant for several years before my husband purchased it for his photography business." "A doctor's office, you say?" Bennett's interest seemed piqued. "What sort of doctor do you know?" "I believe he was a surgeon," Margaret replied, trying to recall the details from the property records she'd reviewed years ago. "Dr. Edward Holloway, if memory serves. He relocated to New York after only a year or two here." Bennett made another note in his journal. "And when your husband acquired the property, did he report anything unusual? Disturbances, strange occurrences, that sort of thing?" "Thomas was not given to flights of fancy, Professor. He was a practical man who dealt in light and shadow, not ghosts and spirits." Margaret's tone was defensive, protective of her late husband's reputation for rationality. "If he experienced anything unusual, he never mentioned it to me." Bennett nodded, seemingly satisfied for the moment. He moved to the exact spot where William had stood during the portrait session, closing his eyes as if attempting to sense something beyond the visible. "The boy said something interesting when he noticed the retouched photograph," Margaret said, breaking the silence. "He's still there, even if you can't see him in the picture anymore." "Those were his words. Children often perceive things that adults have learned to ignore," Bennett replied, his eyes still closed. "Their minds haven't yet been fully constrained by societal expectations of what is, and isn't, possible." "You sound more like a spiritualist than a scientist, Professor." Bennett opened his eyes, offering a small smile. "The best scientists remain open to all possibilities until evidence definitively rules them out." He gestured toward the camera. "May I?" Margaret nodded, and Bennett examined the Rochester optical camera with professional interest, checking the lens and the plate holder with careful precision. "A magnificent instrument," he commented. "The newest model, I believe." "Yes, it arrived just before the Woodridge sitting." "And was this the first time you'd used it?" Margaret nodded. "Yes, though I fail to see how that's relevant." Bennett closed the camera case thoughtfully. "Objects sometimes retain impressions of their previous environments or handlers. It's a theory in paranormal research that certain items can act as conduits for energies or entities." Margaret couldn't contain a skeptical laugh. "You believe my camera is haunted, Professor? That seems rather far-fetched, even for paranormal research." "Not haunted, precisely," Bennett clarified. "More that it might have properties that make it particularly sensitive to certain phenomena. New technological advancements often yield unexpected results. The X-ray was discovered quite by accident, you know." Before Margaret could respond, the studio door opened, the bell jingling cheerfully. Clara entered, looking surprised to find Margaret with a visitor. "Oh, I'm sorry, Mrs. Blackwell. I didn't realize you had returned." "I came to prepare for tomorrow's appointments." She glanced curiously at Bennett. "It's quite all right, Clara. This is Professor Bennett from the university. He's single, quotes, S, dot, dot double quotes." Margaret hesitated, unsure how to explain the professor's presence without sounding irrational. "I'm consulting with Mrs. Blackwell on some technical aspects of photography." Bennett interjected smoothly, extending his hand to Clara. "The science of image creation is advancing rapidly, and Mrs. Blackwell is at the forefront of implementing these advancements." Clara seemed satisfied with this explanation, though she cast a curious glance at Bennett's notebook and measuring tools. "Clara," Margaret said, "do you recall anything unusual about the Woodridge family sitting, particularly regarding the young boy William?" Clara considered the question. Well, he was unusually still for a child his age. Most youngsters fidget during the exposure, but he remained perfectly motionless. And, double quotes, she hesitated. Yes? Bennett prompted gently. He asked me a strange question while you were setting up the camera. Mrs. Blackwell. He wanted to know if someone had died in the studio. Margaret felt a chill run through her. What did you tell him? I said no, of course. I mean, not that I know of. It seemed an odd question for a child. Clara looked between Margaret and Bennett, sensing the tension her words had created. Was that wrong of me? Not at all, Margaret assured her. Children ask all manner of curious questions. After Clara had gone to the back room to arrange the next day's equipment, Bennett turned to Margaret, his expression grave. I believe we need to learn more about Dr. Holloway, the surgeon who once practiced here. And he added, I think we must find a way to speak with young William Woodridge. Despite his father's likely objections, Margaret felt torn between her desire for a rational explanation and her growing fear that what Bennett suggested, something beyond the rational, might actually be true, even if I believed in such things. Professor, which I don't. What possible connection could there be between a long-departed doctor, my new camera, and a strange reflection in a child's eyes? Bennett's response was measured but chilling. That, Mrs. Blackwell, is precisely what we need to discover. Before whatever presence is making itself known decides to do more than simply appear in a photograph, research into Dr. Edward Holloway proved more difficult than anticipated. The Great Fire had destroyed many of Chicago's records, and those that survived were often incomplete or poorly maintained. Margaret found herself spending hours at the Chicago Historical Society, poring over medical registries and property deeds. What she discovered disturbed her more than she cared to admit. Dr. Holloway had indeed been a surgeon, but his departure from Chicago had not been voluntary. Several complaints had been filed against him by patients' families, alleging malpractice, and in one particularly disturbing case, experimentation without consent. The medical board had been in the process of investigating these claims when Holloway abruptly closed his practice and disappeared. Not to New York, as the property records suggested, but to parts unknown. More troubling still was a small newspaper article Margaret uncovered from 1871, just before the fire. A young assistant in Holloway's practice had vanished under mysterious circumstances. The doctor claimed the man had resigned and left the city, but no trace of him was ever found. The investigation into his disappearance had been halted by the chaos of the fire, and apparently never resumed. The assistant's name was William Keene. Margaret sat back in her chair at the Historical Society, her mind racing. A missing assistant named William. A child named William whose eyes reflected someone who wasn't there. It seemed too coincidental, yet she remained reluctant to draw the supernatural conclusion that Bennett seemed to favor. That evening she met with the professor at a small cafe near the university, away from her studio where they might be overheard by Clara or interrupted by clients. Your research confirms my suspicions, Bennett said after Margaret had shared her findings. This Dr. Holloway appears to have been engaged in highly questionable practices, and the disappearance of his assistant under such circumstances is extremely suspicious. It's circumstantial at best, Margaret argued, though with less conviction than before, and it still doesn't explain the reflection in the photograph. Even if something unfortunate happened to William Keene, why would his image appear now in my studio more than 20 years later? Bennett leaned forward, his voice low. Spirits or energies, if you prefer a more scientific term, remain dormant until something triggers their manifestation. Your new camera may have served as such a trigger, or perhaps young William Woodridge himself possesses qualities that make him sensitive to such presences. Margaret shook her head, still resistant to the idea. This is all speculation, Professor. What we need is evidence. Indeed, which is why I've taken the liberty of arranging a meeting with the Woodridge boy. At Margaret's startled expression, Bennett raised a hand, not through his father. I approached his school directly. He's to be released into my care tomorrow afternoon for what his headmaster believes is a psychological study I'm conducting on gifted children. That's highly irregular, Professor. If the alderman discovers this deception sometimes, irregular methods are necessary when conventional approaches are closed to us. Bennett's expression was unapologetic. I've also arranged for a medium to join us at your studio tomorrow evening. A medium? Margaret couldn't keep the disdain from her voice. I agreed to scientific investigation, Professor. Not a seance. Mrs. Harrington is not your typical spiritualist charlatan, Bennett assured her. She approaches her work with scientific rigor and has assisted me in several investigations. She has proven remarkably accurate in perceiving energies that linger in locations where traumatic events have occurred. Margaret remained skeptical, but found herself running out of conventional explanations for what she had captured in her photograph. Very well. but I insist that any interaction with the Woodridge boy remain purely conversational. No hypnosis, no spiritualist techniques, nothing that might frighten him or that his father could later object to. Of course, Bennett agreed readily. My interest is in his perception of what appeared in your studio, nothing more. As they parted ways, Margaret couldn't shake the feeling that she was being watched. The streets of Chicago were busy with evening traffic carriages rattling past, pedestrians hurrying home before darkness fell completely, yet she felt isolated, as if moving through the crowd in a bubble of cold air. Twice she turned, certain she had glimpsed a tall figure following her, only to see nothing unusual among the city's bustling population. By the time she reached her studio, her nerves were taut with tension. The building was dark, Clara having gone home hours earlier. Margaret unlocked the door, stepping into the familiar space that now seemed somehow alien. The smell of chemicals no longer comforted her as it once had. She lit the gas lamps, driving back the shadows, and moved through the studio, checking that everything was in its proper place. All seemed normal until she reached her desk. The drawer where she had locked the original, unretouched Woodridge portrait stood open, its contents disturbed. The photograph itself lay on the desk's surface, William's eyes staring up at her with their impossible reflection clearly visible even in the dim lamplight. Margaret was certain she had locked the drawer. She was equally certain that she had the only key. With trembling hands, she returned the photograph to the drawer, locked it, and then, after a moment's hesitation, placed the key around her neck on a thin silver chain she normally used for her watch, as she turned to leave the studio for her apartment upstairs. The largest of the gas lamps flickered and went out, plunging that corner of the room into darkness. Margaret froze, her heart pounding. From the shadows came a soft, scraping sound like fingernails against wood. "Who's there?" she demanded, her voice stronger than she felt. The scraping stopped. The silence that followed was somehow worse. Margaret backed toward the door, unwilling to turn her back on the darkened corner. As she reached for the doorknob, she could have sworn she heard a whisper, "William," the following afternoon. Margaret met Professor Bennett and young William Woodridge at a quiet tea shop several blocks from the studio. She had been reluctant to return there alone after the previous night's unsettling experience, though in the light of day she had almost convinced herself that fatigue and suggestion had caused her to imagine the whisper, the scraping sounds. William Woodridge sat opposite her, a cup of hot chocolate cooling before him, his expression serious beyond his years. He showed no surprise at having been removed from school to meet with strangers. Accepting Bennett's explanation about a study of gifted children with calm equanimity, William Bennett began gently, "Mrs. Blackwell has shown me the original version of your family portrait, the one where your eyes reflect something unusual." The boy nodded, unsurprised. "You saw him too, then? The figure reflected in your eyes?" "Yes, I saw him." Bennett's tone remained calm, conversational. "Can you tell us about him? Have you seen him before?" William glanced at Margaret, then back to Bennett. "He was standing behind Mrs. Blackwell when she took our picture. Tall and thin, wearing old-fashioned clothes. A doctor's clothes." Margaret felt a chill run through her. She had told neither Bennett nor the boy about Dr. Holloway. "How do you know he was a doctor, William?" she asked, trying to keep her voice steady. "He had one of those things around his neck for listening to hearts." The boy mimed a stethoscope. "And there were dark stains on his coat, like when I fell at school and the nurse cleaned my cut. But much more. Blood." The boy was describing blood stains. "Did he speak to you?" Bennett asked. William shook his head. "Not then, but I've heard him since." "Since the photograph was taken?" Margaret leaned forward, her skepticism momentarily forgotten. "What does he say?" "He says his name is William, too." "Like me." The boy's voice dropped to a whisper. "He says bad things happened to him in your picture place. He says the doctor hurt him." Bennett and Margaret exchanged glances. This aligned too perfectly with what they had discovered about Dr. Holloway and his missing assistant to be coincidence or imagination. William Bennett said carefully, "Would you be willing to visit Mrs. Blackwell's studio with us, just to talk more about what you saw?" The boy hesitated, fear flashing across his features. "He's angry there. He doesn't like that no one knows what happened to him." "We're trying to find out," Margaret said, surprising herself with the sincerity in her voice. "If something bad happened to him, we want to know the truth." William considered this, then nodded solemnly. "All right, but not when it's dark. He's stronger in the dark." They arranged to bring William to the studio immediately, with a promise to return him to his school before his parents would expect him home. As they paid for their tea, Margaret found herself wondering how she had gone from rational skeptic to apparently accepting the testimony of a child regarding a ghost. Yet the boy's description of the figure, a doctor with bloodstains, matched too closely with their research to dismiss. The studio appeared perfectly normal in the afternoon light. Clara was there preparing for an evening appointment and looked surprised to see Margaret return with Bennett and a child she recognized from the Woodridge portrait. "Clara," Margaret said smoothly, "Professor Bennett is continuing his research on photographic techniques. Young William here is assisting us with a demonstration. Would you mind giving us the studio for an hour? Perhaps you could deliver those prints to the Harrison family. They've been waiting since Tuesday." Clara, ever efficient, gathered the Harrison portraits and left without question, though Margaret noted her curious glance at William as she departed. Once alone, Bennett guided William to the spot where he had stood for the family portrait. "Now, William, can you tell us if you sense anything here? Any presence or unusual feeling?" The boy closed his eyes, his small face scrunched in concentration. After a moment, he pointed toward a door at the back of the studio, a door that Margaret used as a storage closet. "He's in there," William said, or ... he was in there. That's where it happened. Margaret approached the closet with trepidation. It was a small space where she kept extra equipment, chemicals, and photographic plates. She'd never given it much thought. It had been arranged this way when Thomas acquired the studio. "This was just a closet when my husband purchased the building," she said. "It's always been storage." Before that, William insisted. Before it was pictures. When it was a doctor place. Bennett moved to the closet door, examining it with careful attention. "May I?" he asked Margaret, who nodded. The professor opened the door, revealing shelves of photographic supplies. Nothing unusual, nothing suspicious. But Bennett wasn't looking at the shelves. He was examining the floor. "Mrs. Blackwell, do you know what's beneath these floorboards?" Margaret shook her head. "I assume the building's foundation." "Why?" Bennett knelt, running his hand along the edge of the wooden floor. "The boards in this closet are newer than those in the rest of the studio. They've been replaced. And look here." He pointed to a dark stain in one corner, almost hidden beneath a shelf. "That appears to be old blood." William had retreated to the far side of the studio, watching them with wide, frightened eyes. "He says that's where it happened, where the doctor cut him open." Margaret felt physically ill. Could it be possible? Had Dr. Holloway murdered his assistant in what was now her photography studio? Had he hidden the body beneath the floorboards? "We need to contact the authorities," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. Bennett nodded grimly. "Yes, but not yet. We need more evidence than a stain and a child's testimony, however compelling. Tonight, with Mrs. Harrington's assistance, we may learn more." As they escorted William back to his school, the boy turned to Margaret, his expression grave beyond his years. "He wants you to find him," he said. "He's been waiting a long time for someone to see him." Margaret nodded, silent promise to a child, and perhaps to a ghost, that she would uncover the truth, however disturbing it might be. Mrs. Harrington arrived at the studio precisely at 7 o'clock that evening. She was not what Margaret had expected in a medium, no flowing robes or dramatic airs, but rather a sensible woman of middle age dressed in a practical gray dress, her manner brisk and businesslike. "Professor Bennett has explained the situation," she said after introductions had been made. "A potentially violent death, a spirit unable to rest, manifesting through a photographic medium." She surveyed the studio with sharp eyes. "There is definitely a presence here. Strong, troubled." Margaret remained skeptical, but increasingly willing to consider explanations beyond the rationale. "Can you ... communicate with it?" "I don't perform seances, Mrs. Blackwell, if that's what you're asking. My gift is more one of perception than communication. I sense impressions, emotions, sometimes fragments of memory left behind by those who misses." Harrington moved slowly through the studio, her eyes half closed, hands occasionally reaching out as if feeling the air itself. "There is definitely a presence here. Strong, troubled." Margaret remained skeptical, but increasingly willing to consider explanations beyond the rationale. "Can you ... communicate with it?" "I don't perform seances, Mrs. Blackwell, if that's what you're asking. My gift is more one of perception than communication. I sense impressions, emotions, sometimes fragments of memory left behind by those who have experienced trauma." She paused near Margaret's desk. "You've kept something of his here, haven't you?" "The photograph." Margaret instinctively touched the key hanging around her neck. "Yes. In the drawer. May I see it?" With hesitation, Margaret unlocked the drawer and retrieved the original Woodridge portrait. Mrs. Harrington did not touch it, but leaned close, studying the reflection in William's eyes. "Yes," she murmured, "he's quite clear to me now. William Keene, 23 years old when he died. Ambitious, intelligent. He trusted the doctor." Her face contorted briefly in what appeared to be pain. "A mistake." Bennett had been taking notes, but paused at this. "Can you sense what happened to him?" Mrs. Harrington moved toward the storage closet that William had indicated earlier. It was here. Holloway was conducting experiments, unethical. He believed he could perfect a surgical technique that would allow access to the brain without causing death. William discovered his notes, confronted him. She pressed her hand against the closet door. Holloway couldn't risk exposure. He attacked William here, used his own experimental technique on him while he was still conscious. Margaret felt nauseated at the description, and then buried him beneath the floorboards. The fire came shortly after. Holloway used the chaos to disappear, start again elsewhere. Mrs. Harrington opened her eyes, looking drained. William's spirit has remained, bound to this place by the trauma of his death and the injustice of his murderer escaping punishment. Professor Bennett set down his notebook. We need to examine beneath those floorboards. If William Keene's remains are indeed there, we have evidence of a crime that the authorities cannot ignore, regardless of how much time has passed. Margaret nodded, finally fully committed to the investigation. I'll send a message to Clara that we'll need the studio undisturbed until tomorrow. We can remove the floorboards tonight. As Bennett went to find tools suitable for prying up the old wood, Mrs. Harrington took Margaret's arm. There's something else you should know, she said quietly. The spirit William Keene, he's been trying to reach out for years. Your husband, ... he sensed something, didn't he? Something he never shared with you. Margaret stiffened. Thomas never mentioned anything unusual about the studio, but he changed after acquiring it, didn't he? Became withdrawn, perhaps. Spent long hours alone here. The accuracy of the medium's words sent a chill through Margaret. Thomas had indeed changed in the months before his death, becoming distant, working late into the night alone in the studio. She had attributed it to financial worries, the stress of building his business. What are you suggesting? I believe your husband became aware of William Keene's presence. Perhaps even began investigating as you are now. But something stopped him. Fear, perhaps. Or ... Mrs. Harrington hesitated. Or what? Margaret demanded. William Keene is not the only presence I sense here, Mrs. Blackwell. There's something else. Something darker. I believe it may be Holloway himself. Bennett worked methodically, removing board after board until they had exposed a section of earth approximately 6 feet long by 3 feet wide. We'll need to dig, he said, wiping sweat from his brow despite the cool evening air. They took turns with a small garden spade Margaret had found in the building's shared courtyard. The soil was compacted, difficult to penetrate. After nearly an hour of effort, Bennett's spade struck something solid with a dull thud. There's something here, he announced, setting aside the spade and using his hands to clear away the remaining dirt. Gradually, they uncovered what appeared to be a medical bag, its leather deteriorated but still intact. Inside were surgical instruments, stained dark with what could only be blood, and a small notebook, its pages yellow with age. Holloway's, Mrs. Harrington confirmed without touching the items. His instruments, his notes. Bennett carefully opened the notebook, its binding crackling with age. These appear to be records of his experiments, he said, his voice tight with disgust as he skimmed the pages. Detailed descriptions of procedures performed on unwilling subjects. Not just William Keene, there were others. They continued digging, and approximately 2 feet beneath the medical bag they found what they had truly been searching for: human remains. A skeleton still partially clothed in the decayed remnants of a young man's suit. The skull showed evidence of crude surgical intervention, a circular hole bored into the cranium. Margaret turned away, unable to look at the grisly discovery. We must contact the police immediately. Bennett nodded grimly. Yes, this is evidence of murder, regardless of how much time has passed. Holloway must be brought to justice if he still lives. As Margaret moved to the telephone on her desk, the gas lamps throughout the studio flickered violently. The temperature in the room plummeted, their breath suddenly visible in the cold air. He knows, Mrs. Harrington whispered, her face pale. Holloway. He's here too. The police arrived within the hour, 2 officers followed by a detective and the city medical examiner. They regarded the excavated closet floor with professional detachment, taking statements from Margaret Bennett and Mrs. Harrington about how they had come to suspect a body might be buried there. Margaret provided a carefully edited version of events, omitting the supernatural elements of their investigation. She spoke instead of historical research into the building's previous occupants and structural abnormalities that had raised their suspicions. Detective Sullivan, a weather-beaten man with shrewd eyes, seemed skeptical but proceeded methodically. Say this, doctor. Holloway disappeared after the Great Fire. Never practiced medicine in Chicago again? That's correct, Bennett confirmed. Our research indicates he may have changed his name and relocated, possibly to the East Coast. The medical examiner completed his preliminary examination of the remains. Male, approximately 20 to 25 years of age. Dead at least 20 years, possibly longer. Cause of death appears to be this cranial injury, deliberate trepanation, from the look of it. Not accidental murder, then, Sullivan concluded. Though prosecuting a case this old will be challenging, especially if the perpetrator assumed a new identity or is deceased himself. The remains in Holloway's medical bag were carefully removed for further examination. Sullivan informed them that the studio would be considered a crime scene until their investigation was complete, meaning Margaret would be unable to conduct business there for at least several days. As the police prepared to depart, Sullivan approached Margaret. "One thing puzzles me, Mrs. Blackwell. What prompted you to investigate this matter now, after all these years?" Margaret hesitated, unwilling to mention the photograph or William Woodridge's involvement. "Professor Bennett has been researching historical crimes in Chicago. When he approached me about the building's history, we decided to investigate further." Sullivan didn't appear entirely convinced, but nodded. "We'll be in touch if we have further questions. Please don't leave the city without informing us." After the police had gone, Margaret, Bennett, and Mrs. Harrington gathered in the front of the studio. The air remained unnaturally cold despite the spring evening. "What happens now?" Margaret asked. "Will William Keene's spirit rest now that his remains have been found?" Mrs. Harrington shook her head slowly. "Not until justice is fully served. And there's still the matter of Holloway's presence. I sense he's extremely angry that his crime has been discovered." "But surely he's dead by now," Margaret argued. "Even if he survived the fire and established himself elsewhere, he would be very elderly. If alive at all, his physical form may be gone." Mrs. Harrington acknowledged, "But his spirit remains attached to this place, to his crimes, and it's powerful, fueled by malice and the fear of discovery." Bennett had been examining Holloway's notebook, which the police had allowed him to keep temporarily as potential research material. According to these notes, Holloway believed he could achieve a form of immortality through his experiments. He was attempting to isolate what he called the life essence in the brain, to preserve consciousness beyond death. "Madness," Margaret whispered. "Yes, but madness with purpose. And if he truly believed in what he was doing—" Bennett's voice trailed off. A sudden crash from the back of the studio made them all jump. Margaret's new camera had fallen from its tripod, the expensive lens shattering on the hardwood floor. "We should leave," Mrs. Harrington said urgently. "It's not safe here tonight. Not after what we've uncovered." They gathered their belongings quickly. As they moved toward the door, Margaret felt a sharp pain in her hand. Looking down, she saw a thin cut across her palm, blood welling from the wound. "I must have caught it on something," she murmured, confused. There had been nothing sharp nearby. Mrs. Harrington's face paled as she looked at Margaret's bleeding hand. "That's a warning. He's marking you as his next subject." Outside, in the relative safety of the gaslit street, they agreed to meet the following morning at Bennett's university office. Margaret would stay at a hotel rather than return to her apartment above the studio. As she prepared to depart in a hired carriage, Bennett placed a protective hand on her arm. "Be careful, Mrs. Blackwell. Whatever's happening here, it's centered on you and your photography. The camera, the portrait, they've become conduits for something dangerous." Margaret nodded, her skepticism now entirely abandoned in the face of what she had witnessed. "What about the boy William Woodridge? Should we warn his family?" "I'll send a message to the alderman," Bennett assured her, "though I doubt he'll believe such a warning without evidence." As Margaret's carriage pulled away, she looked back at her studio building. For a brief moment she thought she saw a figure in the second-floor window of her apartment, tall and thin, watching her departure with cold, calculating eyes. Margaret spent a restless night at the Palmer House Hotel, her dreams haunted by images of William Keene's remains and the reflection in young William Woodridge's eyes. She woke early, exhausted but determined to bring the investigation to its conclusion. At Bennett's office they found unexpected news waiting. Detective Sullivan had sent a message. Based on the evidence in Holloway's notebook and dental records from medical school registries, they had tentatively identified the remains as those of William Keene. More surprising, their investigation into Holloway's disappearance had yielded a promising lead. A physician matching Holloway's description established a practice in Baltimore in 1872. Under the name Edward Blackwell, Bennett read from Sullivan's note. "No relation to your late husband, I presume?" Margaret felt the blood drain from her face. Thomas never spoke of his family. He said they had died in a fever outbreak when he was young. He was raised by distant relatives. Mrs. Harrington, who had joined them at Bennett's request, closed her eyes briefly. "There's a connection. I've sensed it from the beginning, but couldn't place it. Your husband, he was related to Holloway. A nephew, perhaps? Or a son?" "Impossible," Margaret whispered, though doubt had already taken root. Thomas had purchased the studio building specifically, insisting on it despite its poor condition and inconvenient location. He had spent countless hours alone there, becoming increasingly withdrawn before his sudden death from what the doctors had called a cerebral hemorrhage. Bennett was consulting his notes. The Baltimore physician, Edward Blackwell, died in 1891, 3 years before your husband's death. The timing, double quotes, my God, Margaret breathed. Thomas inherited more than just Holloway's name. He inherited his madness, his obsession. The notebook, Mrs. Harrington urged. Check the later entries. Bennett turned to the final pages of Holloway's journal. The handwriting had changed subtly, becoming more refined while maintaining similar characteristics to the earlier entries. These entries are dated 1889 through 1891, Bennett confirmed. After Holloway's supposed death, listen to this, my uncle's work was visionary but flawed. His methods were crude, his understanding of the brain's spiritual essence incomplete. I have refined the process. Soon I will be ready for the final experiment that will prove his theories correct. Margaret felt physically ill. Thomas wrote that. Thomas continued Holloway's experiments. And then your husband died, Mrs. Harrington said gently. An accident? Or did something go wrong with his final experiment? The implications were horrifying. Had Thomas Blackwell, her husband, the man she had mourned for 3 years, been continuing his uncle's monstrous work in secret? Had he experimented on unwilling subjects as Holloway had done with William Keene? I need to return to the studio, Margaret said suddenly. There will be evidence there. Thomas kept meticulous records of everything. It's not safe, Mrs. Harrington warned. The spirits there, both Keene and Holloway, are agitated, dangerous. I must know the truth, Margaret insisted. Whatever Thomas did, whatever he was, I need to understand. Bennett reluctantly agreed to accompany her, though he insisted they go during daylight hours and that they inform Detective Sullivan of their intentions. The studio appeared eerily normal in the morning light. Police tape marked off the storage closet where Keene's remains had been discovered, but otherwise the space looked exactly as it had for the 3 years Margaret had run the business. She moved directly to Thomas's old desk, a heavy oak piece she had kept more out of sentimentality than necessity. Unlike her own organized workspace, Thomas had kept the desk's drawers locked at all times, the keys on his person even at home. After his death, Margaret had been unable to find the keys and, respecting what she believed to be his privacy, had never forced the locks. Now, with Bennett's assistance, they pried open the drawers with a letter opener. Inside, they found ledgers, correspondence, and a small leather-bound journal similar to Holloway's notebook but newer. With trembling hands, Margaret opened it to the first page. The Blackwell continuation, she read aloud. A record of experiments in transcendence and immortality. The journal detailed Thomas's growing obsession with his uncle's work. Initially skeptical, he had purchased the old studio building to investigate rumors of disappearances connected to it. But somewhere along the way, skepticism had turned to belief, and belief to fanaticism. The final entries, dated just days before Thomas's death, described his preparation for what he called the ultimate transition, an attempt to preserve his consciousness beyond death, using techniques refined from Holloway's notes. He didn't die accidentally, Margaret realized, horror washing over her. He killed himself in an attempt to achieve immortality, and he believed he succeeded. As if in response to her words, the temperature in the room plummeted. The pages of the journal began to turn by themselves, flipping rapidly to the final entry, written in a hand that was Thomas's but somehow distorted. More frantic. The procedure is complete. If you are reading this, Margaret, know that I have not left you. I have transcended physical form. I will wait in the space between, and when the time is right, I will return through the lens of your camera. The new Rochester will be my gateway. Our gateway. The realization struck her with devastating clarity. The figure in William Woodridge's eyes wasn't William Keene at all. It was Thomas, or what remained of Thomas after his grotesque experiment. He's been trying to come back, she whispered. Using my photography, using William Woodridge as a conduit because of his sensitivity, his name. We need to destroy the camera, Bennett said firmly. Break the connection. But as they turned toward where the camera had stood, they found it missing from its usual place. In its stead was a freshly developed photograph that Margaret was certain had not been there moments before. It showed Margaret herself standing in the studio, but behind her was a tall, thin figure with Thomas's face twisted into an expression of triumphant malice, and clutched in the figure's hand was a surgical saw, positioned just above Margaret's head. We need to leave. Now, Bennett urged, taking Margaret's arm. As they turned toward the door, they found it blocked by Clara, her expression unnaturally blank, the missing camera clutched in her hands. Clara? Margaret called uncertainly. Are you all right? Clara's voice, when she spoke, was not her own. It was deeper, masculine, with an edge of madness that made Margaret's skin crawl. "My dear Margaret," said Thomas Blackwell through Clara's mouth, "at last we can complete our work together. The final experiment awaits." Clara raised the camera to her eye, the lens pointing directly at Margaret like the barrel of a gun. "Don't look at the lens," Mrs. Harrington shouted, knocking the camera from Clara's hands. It crashed to the floor, the glass of the viewfinder shattering. Clara collapsed as if her strings had been cut, while from the broken camera rose a swirling darkness that coalesced into a human shape, the unmistakable silhouette of Thomas Blackwell, his features distorted with rage. "You cannot stop what has already begun," the apparition hissed, its voice like wind through dead leaves. "The Blackwell legacy will continue. Through you, Margaret. Through your eyes." Margaret felt a sudden burning pain behind her eyes, as if something was trying to force its way into her mind. She screamed, dropping to her knees. Through her agony, she became aware of another presence in the room. A younger man, spectral but distinct from Thomas's malevolent form. William Keene, his ghostly features determined, placed himself between Margaret and the dark entity that had been her husband. "You will not claim another victim, Blackwell," Keene's spirit declared. "Your uncle's evil ends here." The two entities clashed in a silent, spiritual battle that bent the light in the room, casting impossible shadows across the walls. Margaret felt Bennett and Mrs. Harrington pulling her toward the door, away from the supernatural conflict. As they reached the threshold, Margaret looked back to see William Keene's spirit enveloping Thomas's darker form, containing it, dragging it downward through the floor toward the makeshift grave where Keene's remains had been discovered. "He's sacrificing himself to stop Thomas," Mrs. Harrington explained as they escaped into the street, binding Blackwell's spirit to his own, forcing him to move on from this world. The ground beneath the studio seemed to tremble momentarily. Then stillness descended, a quiet that felt both empty and peaceful. Later that day, Detective Sullivan informed them that Clara had no memory of what had transpired. Medical examination revealed nothing physically wrong with her beyond exhaustion. The investigation into Dr. Edward Holloway and Thomas Blackwell continued, revealing a disturbing legacy of unethical experiments and possible murders spanning decades. William Keene's remains were properly buried in Graceland Cemetery, with Margaret attending the small service alongside Professor Bennett and Mrs. Harrington. As for the Woodridge family, Margaret delivered a completely new set of portraits taken with a different camera. Young William seemed lighter somehow, his eyes now reflecting nothing more than the innocent curiosity of childhood. When Margaret asked if he still sensed any presence in the studio, he shook his head. "They're both gone now," he said simply. "They found what they were looking for." Margaret never returned to photography. She sold the studio building, which was eventually demolished to make way for a new department store. The Rochester camera was destroyed, its pieces scattered and buried in unconsecrated ground at Mrs. Harrington's insistence. Years later, when asked about her abrupt career change, Margaret would offer an enigmatic smile and say only that she had learned to see too, clearly through the lens that sometimes what looks back from a photograph is more than just a reflection of what stands before the camera. In her private collection remained only one image from her days as a photographer, the original Woodridge portrait, with young Williams's eyes reflecting a presence that should not have been there, a warning and a reminder of how thin the veil can be between the world of the living and whatever waits beyond the final flash of light.